Dear Santa, please send me a dad. The words were written in purple crayon on paper torn from a coloring book, each letter wobbling with the careful effort of a 5-year-old hand that had never held anything more valuable than hope. Sharon Bennett sat cross-legged on the floor of an apartment where winter crept through window cracks like an uninvited ghost, her breath visible in air that the flickering space heater couldn't warm. She decorated the margins with drawings of 3 stick figures holding hands, the middle one taller than the others, because even at 5 she understood that families were supposed to have a particular shape. The letter wasn't addressed to any specific location, because Sharon's understanding of Santa's logistics remained beautifully uncomplicated by adult skepticism. Her fingers, small and perpetually cold, gripped the crayon with intensity that suggested this wasn't just a letter, but a lifeline. Outside, New York City wore December like a weapon, temperatures dropping to levels that made homeless people disappear from their usual corners. The kind of cold that didn't just chill skin, but settled into bones and stayed there, a constant reminder that survival required resources Sharon's family didn't possess. Street vendors packed up early, their breath forming clouds that dissipated into darkness, while yellow cabs splashed through slush that would freeze into treacherous ice. Sharon folded her letter with the intense concentration children bring to tasks they believe hold magic, creasing each edge with fingers that bore tiny cuts from helping her mother sort recycling. She'd watched other kids at the community center drop letters into a red mailbox decorated with cotton snow and cardboard reindeer, their parents standing behind them with phones ready to capture the moment. But Catherine worked jobs that kept her moving through the city like a shadow, cleaning office buildings after midnight and serving tables on weekends. The girl tucked the letter into her coat pocket, the same threadbare jacket she'd worn since last winter, its sleeves now stopping 3 inches short of her wrists. Tomorrow her mother would take her to the donation center where people left toys and clothes for families who needed them, though Catherine's pride made her avoid these places until necessity overrode shame. Sharon had overheard enough whispered phone conversations to understand that rent was late, that the electricity company had sent final notices. At the Riverside Community Center, volunteers had set up a cheerful display of donation boxes, where families could drop off gifts for children whose parents couldn't afford Christmas. The boxes were labeled by age and gender, decorated with wrapping paper that was already peeling at the corners from humidity and constant handling. Sharon's letter should have gone into the box marked Letters to Santa, alongside dozens of others, innocent wishes for dolls and trucks and video games. But as Catherine set down the small bag of outgrown clothes they were contributing, Sharon's fingers trembled with cold, and the letter slipped from her pocket unnoticed. It fell not into the designated box, but into the narrow gap between the donation table and the wall, sliding down into shadows where it wedged against heating pipes. No one saw it disappear, this small piece of paper carrying an enormous wish, lost in the infrastructure of charity that couldn't catch everything. The letter remained there while families came and went, while volunteers sorted through contributions and distributed them to grateful recipients, while the community center closed for the night. 3 days later, a maintenance crew came to repair a water leak that had damaged the community center's back wall. The letter had worked itself loose from the pipes during the leak, carried by water that seeped through old plaster and pooled on the floor. One of the workers, hurrying to finish the job before his shift ended, scooped up debris that included Sharon's letter and tossed everything into a black garbage bag. The letter traveled through the city's waste management system, compressed in a truck, with hundreds of other pieces of discarded paper, all of them equally meaningless to the machinery. But the garbage truck's route that day included a pickup from the building that housed Giulio Marchetti's legitimate business operations. The driver, running behind schedule, parked in the alley that ran between the building and the service entrance to the underground parking garage. He heaved bags into the truck with practiced efficiency, not noticing when one bag caught on a piece of exposed metal and tore, spilling its contents. The torn bag deposited debris across pavement that was slick with ice and motor oil, scattering paper and refuse into shadows where cleaning crews wouldn't find it until morning. Giulio Marchetti descended into his private parking level at 11:47 that night, his movements tracked by security cameras that fed footage to monitors watched by men who understood their employer's safety. He'd spent the evening at a restaurant he owned, conducting business that left no paper trail over plates of ossobuco and glasses of Barolo. His car, a black Mercedes with bulletproof glass and reinforced panels, sat in a spot that required no sign because everyone knew which space belonged to him. The parking garage was his domain, swept clean each morning, temperature controlled, secured by 3 separate systems that made it safer than most bank vaults. But the torn garbage bag had deposited its contents near the garage entrance, where maintenance hadn't yet noticed the spill. Giulio's driver was sick that night, forcing him to navigate the garage himself, an inconvenience that irritated him in ways that went beyond simple logistics. He noticed the scattered garbage immediately, because disorder in his controlled environment registered as threat before it registered as mess. His hand moved toward the weapon he carried in a shoulder holster, while his eyes scanned for movement, for ambush, for anything that didn't belong. The letter caught his attention, because it was the only piece of paper in the debris that wasn't coffee-stained or food-smeared, its purple crayon markings visible even from 10 feet away. Giulio approached it with the caution of a man who'd survived 2 decades in a world where poison could hide in unexpected places. He used his shoe to flip the paper over, revealing the childish handwriting that spelled out a wish so pure it seemed obscene in its innocence. "Dear Santa, please send me a dad." The word stopped him more effectively than any weapon ever had. Giulio Marchetti, who'd ordered executions with less emotion than most people showed deciding what to eat for lunch, who'd built an empire through violence and intimidation, stood in his private parking garage staring at a letter. His daughter had written to Santa once, years ago, before the accident that had taken her and her mother and left him hollow. That loss had made him more dangerous because he had nothing left to lose. No weakness enemies could exploit. No soft places where emotion could penetrate the armor he'd constructed. He picked up the letter with hands that had broken bones and pulled triggers, but now trembled slightly with something he refused to identify as emotion. The drawing in the margin showed 3 stick figures, a family unit so simple a child could create it but so complex that some people spent entire lives failing to achieve it. Sharon's name was printed at the bottom in letters that leaned in different directions, next to her age written as a backward 5. There was no address, no last name, nothing that would help anyone locate this child who believed Santa could solve the fundamental problem of her incomplete family. Giulio stood in that parking garage for 3 minutes and 47 seconds, long enough that his security team upstairs exchanged worried glances and checked their monitors. The letter weighed nothing but felt heavier than any burden he'd carried in the years since he'd stopped being a father. He should have thrown it away, should have let it disappear back into the garbage system that had delivered it to him by random chance. Instead, he folded it carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of his coat, next to his heart, where it rested against silk lining like an accusation. The Mercedes remained parked while Giulio returned to the elevator, his mind already working through problems that had nothing to do with territory or rivals or the federal investigation. Catherine Bennett pushed her cleaning cart through the executive floor of the Meridian building at 1:37 in the morning, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to make every motion count. The vacuum cleaner's cord trailed behind her like a tether to ordinary reality, while she navigated spaces where daytime occupants made decisions affecting thousands of people. Her uniform, provided by the contracting company that employed her at minimum wage, hung loose on a frame that had shed 15 pounds in the past 6 months. These hallways where she worked belonged to a different world than the one she inhabited during daylight hours, a realm of leather chairs and mahogany desks where even the air seemed cleaner. The Meridian building housed various companies that did business requiring beautiful facades, including several legitimate enterprises that served as fronts for operations that couldn't withstand scrutiny. Catherine didn't know the details, because the janitorial staff wasn't briefed on tenant activities, but she'd learned to recognize which offices had security beyond standard corporate measures. The 20th floor where she worked tonight featured cameras in every corner, reinforced doors with keycard access, and a particular quality of silence that suggested secrets worth protecting. She'd been warned during training never to open closed file cabinets, never to read documents left on desks, never to ask questions about the men in expensive suits. Tonight the executive floor was empty, except for her, and the hum of computers left running, their screens casting blue light across desks. Catherine cleaned around artifacts of lives she couldn't access, wiping down surfaces that would be dirty again by tomorrow, but that required constant attention because that was the nature of her work. The executive bathroom was her last task, the one she saved for end of shift, because it allowed her a moment to sit on the closed toilet lid and rest. She carried exhaustion the way other people carried purses, as an accessory so constant she barely noticed its weight until she stopped moving long enough to feel it. She locked the bathroom door out of habit, not because anyone else was on this floor, but because privacy was a luxury she claimed wherever possible. The mirror above the sink reflected a woman who looked older than 27, Lines etched around her eyes from squinting through fatigue and worry. Her hands, perpetually red and cracked from cleaning chemicals, shook slightly as she splashed cold water on her face, trying to revive herself enough to finish the shift. The dizziness hit without warning, a sensation of the floor tilting sideways while the walls pressed inward with suffocating closeness. Catherine gripped the edge of the sink, knuckles white, fighting against the darkness that crept into the edges of her vision, like ink spreading through water. She hadn't eaten since the slice of pizza Sharon had left on her plate at breakfast, and that had been 17 hours ago across 2 different jobs. Her knees buckled and she slid down the wall to the tile floor, too tired to fight gravity any longer. The bathroom spun in lazy circles while she pressed her cheek against the cool tile and tried to remember how to breathe without her chest feeling like it was being compressed. This had happened twice before in the past month. These moments where her body simply refused to cooperate with the demands she made of it. She told herself it was just exhaustion, just skipped meals, just the accumulated weight of doing too much with too little. But lying on the floor of an executive bathroom at 2 a.m. while cleaning supplies scattered around her, Catherine confronted the reality she'd been avoiding. She was breaking, physically and financially, held together by willpower and desperation that were themselves running on fumes. Sharon's persistent cough had developed into something that rattled in her chest, something that required medicine they couldn't afford, and doctor visits that would cost more than 3 days' wages. The irony of collapsing in a building that housed more wealth than she'd see in 10 lifetimes wasn't lost on her. These executives whose trash she emptied made in an hour what took her a month of night shifts and weekend doubles. Their offices contained art worth more than her annual salary, watches that cost more than a year of Sharon's medication, pocket change left on desks that represented grocery money for a week. Catherine forced herself to sit up, using the wall for support, while the spinning gradually slowed to something manageable. She couldn't afford to be found like this because being found meant questions, meant potential termination, meant losing this job that barely kept them housed and fed, but was better than nothing. The cleaning company had a policy about health issues, about employees who couldn't perform their duties, about replaceable workers in a city full of desperate people willing to do anything for minimum wage. She pulled herself to her feet using the sink, avoiding her reflection, because she knew what she'd see there and couldn't bear to witness her own deterioration. The cleaning cart waited in the hallway, half her task still incomplete, because she'd wasted precious minutes lying on the floor instead of working. She finished the bathroom quickly, erasing all evidence of her presence, except the lingering scent of industrial cleaner that would dissipate before the executives arrived in the morning. The security office on the ground floor contained monitors that displayed every angle of the building, including the 20th floor executive bathroom where Catherine had collapsed. The night security guard, an older man named Marcus who'd worked this shift for 15 years, had watched the entire incident unfold on screen. He'd reached for his radio twice, preparing to call for help, but something about the way she'd forced herself back up had stopped him. Marcus made a note in his log about checking the 20th floor more frequently, though he didn't specify why. The footage would be reviewed by someone eventually, part of the routine security checks that occurred weekly. But Marcus also knew that footage had a way of getting lost, of being recorded over, of disappearing when certain people wanted it to disappear. He'd been in this business long enough to understand that sometimes seeing everything meant knowing when to see nothing. Meanwhile, 3 floors above Marcus's security station, Giulio Marchetti sat in an office that officially belonged to one of his legitimate businesses, but functionally served as a secondary headquarters. He'd come here after finding the letter, unable to return to his penthouse where silence would force him to confront thoughts he preferred to avoid. The office had its own security system, one that fed to monitors he could access from his desk, showing him views of his building that even Marcus didn't see. He'd been reviewing footage from earlier that evening, checking for any signs of surveillance or unexpected visitors, when he'd noticed the woman on the 20th floor. The cameras captured her collapse in the bathroom, the way she'd slid down the wall like a puppet with cut strings. Giulio had watched without intervening because intervention would require explaining why he was monitoring janitorial staff, why he was in the building at this hour, why he cared about a cleaning woman's welfare. But then he'd zoomed in on her employee badge, visible when she'd pulled herself up using the sink. The name tag read, K. Bennett, in the standardized font the cleaning company used for all their workers. Bennett, the same last name that had been printed at the bottom of the letter currently resting in his coat pocket, written by a 5-year-old who wanted a father. The connection formed in his mind with the certainty of mathematics, 2 data points creating a line that pointed toward something he wasn't sure he wanted to find. Sharon Bennett had written the letter, Kay Bennett cleaned his building's executive floors after midnight. The probability of coincidence was low enough to be dismissed, which meant the woman who'd just collapsed from exhaustion was the mother whose child had asked Santa for a father. Julio sat in his office watching footage of Catherine Bennett finishing her shift, moving through hallways with determination that looked more like survival than choice. The monitors displayed multiple angles of her progress, technical documentation of a life lived in the margins of his world. He should have closed the window, should have returned to the business that required his attention, but something about the way she moved reminded him of someone he'd spent 5 years trying to forget. His daughter had been 7 when the car accident happened, old enough to have opinions about everything, and young enough to believe her father could fix anything. Sophia had inherited her mother's dark hair and his stubbornness, a combination that had made her both delightful and exhausting in the way children are when they haven't learned yet that the world breaks people. She'd drawn pictures constantly, filling notebook after notebook with crayon families that always included 3 figures because their family unit had been complete and happy and utterly unprepared for tragedy. The accident had happened on a Tuesday afternoon, during a rare family outing to a restaurant across town, a celebration of something trivial that Julio couldn't even remember now. A drunk driver had run a red light at an intersection, physics and bad timing combining to destroy everything Julio had built that mattered. His wife died instantly, trapped in metal that rescue workers took 40 minutes to cut through. Sophia had survived the initial impact, but died in the ambulance, her small hand going limp in his, while he screamed at paramedics who were already doing everything possible. The investigation had been brief, because the drunk driver died at the scene, leaving no one for Julio to destroy in retribution except himself. He'd thrown himself into his criminal enterprise with renewed focus, using violence and expansion as replacement for the emotions he refused to process. His organization had doubled in size in the 2 years following the accident, fueled by a man who had nothing to lose and therefore nothing holding him back from the darkest choices his business required. But 5 years had passed since Sophia's death, 5 years of building an empire on the foundation of his grief, and somehow a letter written by a 5-year-old stranger had cracked the wall he'd constructed around that loss. Sharon's backward 5 looked exactly like Sophia's used to, that same confusion about which way the number faced. The 3 stick figures Sharon had drawn echoed the hundreds of similar families Sophia had created, each one a testament to the security she'd felt before security proved to be an illusion. Julio opened his desk drawer and removed a photograph he kept hidden beneath false documents, one of the few images of Sophia he hadn't destroyed in the rage that followed her death. The picture showed her at 6 years old, holding a drawing she'd made in school, grinning with pride that came from believing her father cared about crayon art. He'd thrown away most of her belongings in the months after the funeral, unable to bear the weight of toys that would never be played with, clothes that would never be worn. This photograph had survived only because he'd forgotten it was in this drawer, tucked away during the chaos of grief and rediscovered a year later when he'd stopped destroying everything that reminded him of what he'd lost. He looked at it perhaps once every few months, usually late at night when insomnia kept him awake, and whiskey failed to quiet his thoughts. Sophia's face stared back at him now, with the innocence of someone who'd never imagined her father would outlive her, that childhood would end abruptly, instead of gradually. The connection between Sharon's letter and his own dead daughter was too obvious to ignore, too painful to fully acknowledge. A 5-year-old girl wanted a father, and Julio was a father who'd lost his 5-year-old, symmetry that felt designed rather than accidental. He didn't believe in divine intervention, or cosmic justice, or any of the spiritual concepts that offered comfort to people who needed explanations for chaos. But he also couldn't dismiss the probability that this letter had found him specifically, had traveled through impossible circumstances to land in his parking garage. Marcus's security log showed that Catherine Bennett worked the 20th floor every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday from midnight to 6 a.m., then rushed to her weekend job serving tables at a diner 3 blocks away. She lived in an apartment building in a neighborhood where Julio's organization ran protection rackets, where his money extracted profit from people who had almost nothing. The building's landlord was connected to one of his subsidiary operations, which meant Catherine's rent payments indirectly funded the empire that would destroy her if she ever saw too much or asked the wrong questions. He pulled up her employment file, information easily accessible because the cleaning company contracted with his legitimate businesses and maintained digital records he could access without authorization. Catherine Marie Bennett, 27 years old, hired 6 months ago after her previous employer went bankrupt. She'd listed no emergency contacts beyond a community health clinic, no family members, no friends who might notice if she disappeared. The file indicated she'd passed the basic background check, but hadn't been screened beyond that, because cleaning staff didn't require security clearance. Her daughter wasn't mentioned anywhere in the official documentation, because the cleaning company's policy allowed employees to maintain separation between their personal lives and employment. But Julio had resources beyond official channels, connections to databases that tracked births and school enrollments and medical records. Sharon Marie Bennett, born 5 years and 3 months ago at Mercy Hospital. No father listed on birth certificate. Medical records showed recurring respiratory issues. Recent emergency room visit for fever and cough. Outstanding balance of $3,000 that Catherine was paying off at $50 monthly. The apartment building where they lived had been cited twice for heating violations in the past year. Complaints filed by tenants about inadequate warmth during winter months that went ignored by management who knew the city wouldn't enforce code violations. Julio owned the building through 3 layers of corporate shells, far enough removed that his name appeared nowhere in ownership documents, but close enough that he could make decisions about maintenance and repairs. He'd authorized the minimum spending necessary to avoid serious legal consequences, never considering that real people froze in apartments where his profit margins mattered more than their comfort. Sharon Bennett attended a public elementary school 3 blocks from her apartment, enrolled in kindergarten with teachers who'd noted her intelligence and creativity, but also her frequent absences due to illness. The school records contained copies of drawings similar to the one on her Santa letter, families with 3 figures engaged in activities Sharon could only imagine. Her teacher had written a note suggesting that Sharon might benefit from counseling services to address apparent issues with family structure, a recommendation that went unfollowed because counseling required time and money Catherine didn't have. Julio stared at information that transformed Sharon from abstract concept into specific reality, a child whose life he could now track through documentation that revealed poverty and bureaucratic precision. She'd been born in the same hospital where Sophia had died. Different floors, but same building. Life and death occurring within the same walls. The coincidence felt heavy with meaning Julio wasn't equipped to interpret, connections forming that suggested something larger than random chance at work. He closed the files and returned to the security footage, watching Catherine leave the building at 6:14 a.m., 17 minutes past the end of her official shift. She moved differently now than she had at the beginning, her steps slower, her posture more hunched, exhaustion visible in every movement. She disappeared into the subway entrance that would take her home to the apartment where Sharon waited, where morning would bring breakfast that probably wasn't enough, and medicine they couldn't afford, and another day of making impossible choices about which necessities to prioritize. The rational part of Julio's mind recognized that walking away was the intelligent choice, that getting involved with Catherine and Sharon would complicate his life in ways that served no purpose. He had an empire to run, enemies to manage, investigations to evade. He didn't have time or emotional capacity for a random child whose letter happened to find him through improbable circumstances. The letter was coincidence, nothing more, and reading significance into coincidence was how weak men made disastrous mistakes. But the letter rested in his pocket, like a weight he couldn't shed, and Sophia's photograph stared at him from the desk, with eyes that held expectations he'd failed 5 years ago. For the first time since the accident, Giulio Marchetti allowed himself to consider that perhaps his survival hadn't been meaningless, that perhaps the universe or fate or random chance had preserved him for something beyond building a criminal empire. The thought was uncomfortable, foreign, ridiculous in its implication, that his life could still serve a purpose beyond accumulation of power and money. He stood at his window watching dawn break over New York City, painting the sky in colors that would disappear once full daylight arrived, and the city returned to its usual gray. Somewhere in this same city, a 5-year-old girl was waking up in a cold apartment, probably coughing, definitely unaware that her letter had found exactly the person it needed to find. And somewhere between Giulio's cynicism and Sharon's hope, a possibility existed that neither of them could yet see but that the letter itself seemed to promise. Sharon's cough had worsened over the weekend, evolving from the persistent irritation Catherine had learned to recognize into something deeper that rattled in her daughter's chest, like coins in a jar. The sound kept Catherine awake during the few hours between her night shift and when Sharon needed to wake for school, lying in the darkness listening to her daughter struggle for breath. Monday morning arrived with Sharon's fever spiking to 103 degrees, her small body burning with heat that no amount of cold compresses could reduce. Catherine called the community health clinic where they received subsidized care, waiting on hold for 40 minutes before reaching a receptionist who informed her the next available appointment was in 6 days. 6 days felt like an eternity when Sharon's breathing had developed a wheeze that made every inhale sound like tissue paper being crumpled. The emergency room was an option Catherine had been avoiding, because even with Sharon's basic insurance coverage, the copay and additional costs would consume money earmarked for rent. But by Tuesday afternoon, Sharon's lips had taken on a bluish tint that sent terror through Catherine's chest more effectively than any physical pain she'd experienced. She bundled her daughter in every blanket they owned and took the subway to Mercy Hospital, the same facility where Sharon had been born, and where they'd gone 3 times before for respiratory crises. The emergency room waiting area was packed with people whose desperation matched her own, all of them hoping that illness was urgent enough to be treated, but not so urgent that it signaled something catastrophic. They waited 4 hours before a triage nurse determined Sharon's oxygen levels were low enough to warrant immediate attention. The nurse, a woman in her 50s who'd seen too many children suffer from preventable conditions, didn't comment on the delay in seeking treatment, but her expression communicated judgment Catherine didn't need voiced. She knew she'd waited too long, knew that financial terror had compromised her judgment, knew that good mothers probably chose their children's health over rent, but good mothers probably also had better options than the ones available to her. Sharon was admitted to a pediatric examination room where a young doctor with kind eyes and exhausted face examined her with efficiency that came from treating dozens of similar cases daily. Pneumonia, he announced with the casual delivery of someone who saw this condition regularly enough that its potential lethality had become routine. Sharon would need to be admitted overnight for observation, would require antibiotics and breathing treatments, would need follow-up care that the doctor described while Catherine's mind calculated costs she couldn't afford. The hospital's billing department representative arrived before Sharon had even been assigned a room, a woman whose job required her to discuss money while sick children suffered nearby. She explained that even with Sharon's insurance, the overnight stay would cost approximately $4,000 out of pocket, a number so absurd it momentarily silenced Catherine's ability to process language. $4,000 represented 8 months of her careful $50 payments on their existing medical debt, or 3 months of rent, or the complete disintegration of the financial stability she'd been desperately constructing. Catherine signed papers she barely read, because refusing treatment wasn't an option regardless of cost, committing to debt that would likely follow her for years. Sharon was moved to a pediatric wardroom decorated with cheerful murals of animals that seemed to mock the severity of what brought children to this place. Nurses came and went with practiced efficiency, hooking Sharon up to monitors and IV lines while explaining procedures in voices trained to be simultaneously soothing and professional. By Wednesday morning, Sharon's condition had stabilized enough that the bluish tint had faded from her lips, and her breathing no longer sounded like crumpling paper. But the oxygen saturation monitor showed numbers that concerned the medical staff enough to recommend another night of observation, doubling the financial catastrophe Catherine was already facing. She sat in a chair next to Sharon's bed, holding her daughter's hand while calculating which bills could be ignored, which payments could be skipped, whether their landlord would accept a late rent payment or begin eviction proceedings immediately. Giulio received the information about Sharon's hospitalization, not through any official channel, but through the network of connections that kept him informed about everything occurring within his sphere of influence. One of his associates had a cousin who worked in Mercy Hospital's billing department, someone who occasionally provided information about people of interest. Catherine Bennett's name had been flagged in his system after he'd researched her, set to alert him if she appeared in any database his organization monitored. The cousin reported that Catherine had signed papers for Sharon's treatment looking like someone accepting a death sentence rather than medical care. The billing representative had noted Catherine's existing medical debt, had seen her hands shake while signing authorization forms, had watched her ask if payment plans were available, and then visibly calculate whether even payment plans were financially survivable. It was the kind of human detail that didn't appear in official reports, but that people remembered, because witnessing desperation left impressions. Giulio sat in his office reviewing this information, with the detachment he'd cultivated over decades of making decisions that affected lives he never witnessed directly. Sharon Bennett was hospitalized with pneumonia, facing medical costs her mother couldn't pay, existing in a crisis that would likely push them from barely surviving into complete financial collapse. The logical response was no response, maintaining the distance between his world and theirs, allowing systems already in motion to continue without his interference. But the letter remained in his coat pocket, carried daily like a talisman or curse he couldn't decide between. Sharon had asked Santa for a father, and now Sharon was in a hospital struggling to breathe while her mother signed documents that would bury them both in debt. The connection between the request and the crisis felt too pointed to be coincidence, as if the universe had delivered the letter to Giulio specifically so he could witness the consequences of ignoring it. He made a phone call to someone who specialized in making problems disappear, a fixer who operated in the gray spaces between legal and illegal where Giulio conducted much of his business. The instructions were simple. Pay Sharon Bennett's hospital bills in full, anonymously, through channels that couldn't be traced back to him. Include her existing medical debt in the payment. Clear everything. Make it appear as if a charitable organization had covered the costs, rather than a criminal who'd found a child's letter. The fixer asked no questions, because Giulio paid him to execute instructions rather than understand motivations. By Wednesday afternoon, Mercy Hospital's billing department received notification that the Bennett family's account had been paid in full by an anonymous donor through a foundation that supposedly helped families experiencing medical financial hardship. The billing representative who'd spoken with Catherine tried to verify the foundation's legitimacy and found documentation that appeared authentic, though anyone with Giulio's resources could create authentic-appearing documentation without significant difficulty. Catherine was sitting beside Sharon's bed reading a picture book when a hospital administrator knocked softly and entered with an expression that Catherine initially interpreted as bearing bad news. The woman explained that Sharon's bills had been covered by a charitable foundation, that no payment would be required, that they were free to focus on Sharon's recovery without financial concern. Catherine stared at her in silence, that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable, her mind unable to process information that contradicted everything she understood about how the world worked. The administrator provided paperwork documenting the payment, letterhead from a foundation Catherine had never heard of, explanations about how sometimes families were randomly selected for assistance based on need assessments and available funding. It sounded rehearsed in the way lies often do, when they're told by people who've been instructed what to say, but don't fully believe their own words. Catherine accepted the papers because rejecting them would mean refusing help Sharon desperately needed, but suspicion settled in her chest alongside relief. No one did this, she thought, while the administrator retreated, and Sharon slept peacefully for the first time in days. Foundations didn't randomly pay four-figure hospital bills for families they'd never met, didn't clear existing debt without application processes and verification procedures and waiting periods. Someone specific had done this, someone who knew about their situation, someone who had resources to spend thousands of dollars without requiring gratitude or acknowledgement or any return on investment. The question that kept Catherine awake in the uncomfortable chair beside Sharon's hospital bed wasn't why someone had helped, but who would help while remaining anonymous. People with money demanded recognition for their charity, sought tax benefits and social status and the satisfaction of being publicly generous. Anonymous help suggested either institutional bureaucracy or personal involvement someone wanted to hide, and the hospital's explanation leaned too heavily on the first option to be entirely true. Sharon was discharged from the hospital on Thursday afternoon with prescriptions Catherine could actually afford now that the larger debt had disappeared, medication that would help prevent future respiratory crises. They took a taxi home instead of the subway, a luxury Catherine allowed herself because carrying Sharon and medical supplies through underground stations felt impossible. The taxi driver, a man who'd seen enough of humanity's struggles to recognize them in his passengers, didn't charge for the trip after hearing Sharon cough, waving away Catherine's money with gruff kindness that made her want to cry. The apartment felt colder than Catherine remembered, the inadequate heater struggling against temperatures that had dropped further during Sharon's hospitalization. She settled Sharon on the couch wrapped in blankets and was preparing soup when someone knocked on their door, an unusual occurrence in a building where neighbors maintained careful distance from each other's problems. Through the peephole, she saw a man in an expensive coat that marked him as someone who didn't belong in this hallway, his presence immediately triggering alarm systems developed through years of vulnerability. She opened the door with the chain lock engaged, a barrier that would do nothing against actual threat, but provided psychological comfort. The man smiled in a way that didn't reach his eyes and introduced himself as a building inspector, checking on heating complaints that had been filed recently. His credentials looked official enough, plastic cards with city seals and photographs, but something about his presence felt choreographed rather than spontaneous. He asked to check the heating unit, citing violations that could result in fines for the building management. Catherine let him in because refusing a building inspector could lead to complications she couldn't afford, watching while he examined their space heater with attention that seemed excessive for a routine inspection. He made notes on a clipboard, asked questions about how long they'd lived here, and whether the heating had ever worked adequately. His tone professional, but his eyes cataloging details that went beyond heating concerns. Sharon watched from the couch with the solemn attention sick children bring to adult activities they don't fully understand. The inspector, whose name he'd given as Richardson, spent 15 minutes examining the heating unit before declaring it inadequate for the apartment's square footage and announcing that building management would be required to replace it. He wrote something on official-looking forms and promised that a new heater would be installed within 48 hours, a timeline that seemed impossibly fast for bureaucratic processes Catherine had learned operated in geological time rather than human urgency. He left as efficiently as he'd arrived, his expensive coat disappearing down hallways where luxury was foreign language. 2 days later, as Richardson had promised, installers arrived with a heating unit that looked nothing like the failing space heater they removed. The new system was wall-mounted and powerful, designed for spaces twice the size of their apartment, installed with efficiency that suggested someone had prioritized this job above others. The lead installer, when Catherine asked about cost, assured her that building management was covering everything as part of code violation corrections, though his expression suggested he knew as little about the real story as she did. The apartment reached temperatures Catherine hadn't experienced since they'd moved in 6 months ago, warmth that penetrated walls and eliminated the constant chill that had become their normal existence. Sharon's breathing eased noticeably in the improved conditions, her recovery accelerating without the burden of fighting cold alongside illness. Catherine sat in warmth that felt miraculous, and tried to convince herself that these events were coincidence, that hospital payments and heating repairs weren't connected, that she wasn't being helped by someone whose identity remained deliberately obscured. But coincidence required probability, and the probability of their lives suddenly improving across multiple dimensions simultaneously approached mathematical impossibility. Someone was orchestrating these changes, someone with resources to pay hospital bills and influence building management and operate through intermediaries who delivered help while revealing nothing. The anonymity bothered Catherine more than gratitude moved her, because anonymity suggested purposes beyond simple generosity, motives that might eventually require repayment she couldn't provide. Giulio watched his intervention's effects through reports delivered by the various people he'd employed to execute his plan. The building's heating violations had been real, documented by inspectors he'd paid to actually investigate rather than accept standard bribes to ignore problems. The new heating unit cost more than Catherine made in 3 months, installed by contractors who worked for his organization, and understood that quality mattered when Giulio personally ordered something done. He was fixing problems he'd indirectly created through ownership structures that prioritized profit over tenant welfare. The irony wasn't lost on him that he was correcting negligence his own business practices had enabled, spending money to improve conditions in a building where his policies had allowed deterioration. But the intervention felt less like charity than experiment, testing whether he could still access parts of himself that the past 5 years had buried under grief and violence. Sophia would have been Sharon's age now if the accident hadn't happened, would have been starting elementary school and drawing families with 3 figures, and believing the world was fundamentally good. He authorized additional surveillance of Catherine and Sharon, not to threaten them, but to monitor their well-being in ways that felt increasingly less like observation and more like guardianship. His security team reported that Sharon returned to school the following Monday, that Catherine resumed her night shift at the Meridian building, that their lives had stabilized into routines that looked less desperate than before. The surveillance made Giulio complicit in their daily existence, a silent presence in their story, who influenced events without being acknowledged. The first time he saw Sharon in person, rather than through security footage, happened by accident or design, depending on whether one believed in random chance or inevitable collision. He'd gone to inspect one of his properties in Catherine's neighborhood, a legitimate business interest that coincidentally required him to be near Sharon's school at dismissal time. She emerged from the building with classmates who scattered toward waiting parents while Sharon walked alone toward the crosswalk, her backpack too large for her small frame and her gait showing remnants of recent illness. Giulio watched from his car 50 feet away, close enough to see her face, but far enough to avoid notice in a neighborhood where expensive vehicles attracted attention. Sharon looked exactly like her photograph from the school records, but seeing her in 3 dimensions created impact that documentation couldn't capture. She moved through the world with caution that children shouldn't need to develop, checking both directions twice before crossing streets and keeping distance from adults who weren't clearly supervisors. She stopped at the corner store where Giulio knew Catherine sometimes bought discounted groceries, peering through the window at candy displays she couldn't afford. Her expression held longing without expectation, the look of someone who'd learned that wanting things didn't make them materialize. After 30 seconds of staring, she continued walking toward her apartment building, shoulders hunched against cold that the inadequate coat couldn't fully block despite the new heating unit that would warm her once she arrived home. Something shifted in Giulio's chest, watching this child who'd written him a letter, without knowing his identity, who'd asked Santa for help that had manifested through Giulio's resources rather than Christmas magic. Sharon represented innocence that still existed, despite circumstances designed to destroy it, hope that persisted without evidence that hope was justified. She was everything Sophia had been before the world demonstrated that being innocent and hopeful offered no protection against random tragedy. He made a decision that violated every principle he'd established for maintaining separation between his criminal operations and personal vulnerabilities. He would meet Sharon, not as anonymous benefactor, but as someone who existed in her reality, rather than merely observing it from distance. The decision was irrational and potentially dangerous, creating connections that could be exploited by enemies who looked constantly for weaknesses in Giulio's armor. But 5 years of safety through isolation had brought him nothing except survival, and survival without purpose felt increasingly indistinguishable from elaborate suicide. The opportunity came 2 weeks later, when Giulio arranged to visit the Meridian building during Catherine's shift, timing that required him to be there after midnight, when legitimate business interests wouldn't justify his presence. He used the excuse of checking security protocols, appearing on the 20th floor where Catherine worked with an entourage small enough to avoid intimidation, but large enough to maintain his position's requirements. She was vacuuming when he arrived, the machine's noise preventing her from hearing approaching footsteps, until his presence registered in her peripheral vision. Catherine turned off the vacuum and straightened with the instinct workers develop around people who clearly occupy higher positions in whatever hierarchy governs their intersection. Her employee badge identified her as Kay Bennett, the initial hiding the full name that Giulio already knew, that connected her to the letter that connected them both to circumstances neither fully understood. She apologized for the noise with deference that made Giulio uncomfortable, because he wasn't accustomed to being uncomfortable around people who should fear his power. He asked her name, though he already knew it, pretending their meeting was coincidence rather than orchestration. Catherine provided it with hesitation that suggested she understood power imbalances made even casual conversation potentially dangerous for people in her position. They exchanged pleasantries that felt scripted, because both of them were performing versions of themselves rather than revealing authentic reactions. She mentioned working multiple jobs, information that confirmed what his research had already told him, but that carried different weight coming from her own voice. The conversation that night remained brief, because prolonging it would have raised questions about why someone like Giulio bothered speaking with janitorial staff beyond minimal courtesy. But the interaction opened a channel that he began using with increasing frequency, appearing on the 20th floor during Catherine's shifts with excuses that became progressively less believable. She responded with caution that never fully transformed into comfort, maintaining professional distance that Giulio simultaneously respected and found frustrating because distance prevented the connection he was attempting to establish, without understanding why he needed to establish it. During their third encounter, he mentioned noticing she looked tired and suggested the building's management should provide better break facilities for night staff. 2 weeks later, a break room appeared on the 20th floor, equipped with comfortable furniture and a kitchenette that seemed excessive for 2 janitors who rotated shifts. Catherine accepted this improvement without commenting on its suspicious timing, but her expression when she looked at Giulio during their next conversation communicated awareness that coincidence no longer explained the pattern of beneficial changes affecting her life. Sharon became topic of conversation when Giulio asked about Catherine's family, a personal question that crossed boundaries typically maintained between people of their respective positions. Catherine's face transformed when talking about her daughter, exhaustion giving way to pride that made her look younger than 27. She described Sharon's artistic talent, her love of books, her resilience despite health challenges that had defined much of her short life. The way Catherine spoke about Sharon reminded Giulio of how he'd once talked about Sophia, before loss had taught him that love made people vulnerable in ways that enemies could weaponize. He found reasons to drive past Sharon's school more frequently, watching dismissal time like surveillance footage, except with his own eyes instead of cameras. He learned her routines, the corner store window where she stopped to look at candy, the route she walked home that avoided the block where older kids gathered with teenage aggression. His security team noticed this pattern and expressed concern about their employer developing obsession with a 5-year-old child, implications they didn't voice directly, but that hung in the air during their status meetings. The dangerous moment came when Sharon saw him. He'd been parked across from her school in a vehicle too expensive for the neighborhood, but not unusual enough to attract significant attention. She emerged from the building with her oversized backpack and stopped on the sidewalk, her attention caught by something he didn't initially identify. Then he realized she was looking directly at him through the car window, her small face tilted with curiosity rather than fear, because children her age hadn't yet learned that strange men in expensive cars represented threat. She waved, a small gesture that carried no meaning beyond childish friendliness toward someone whose presence had registered in her awareness. Giulio didn't respond immediately because responding meant acknowledging connection, meant crossing from observation into interaction, meant accepting that this situation had evolved beyond anything he'd originally intended. But her hand remained raised, waiting with patience that suggested she'd learned waiting was often required before adults noticed children, and something in Giulio's chest cracked like ice breaking. He waved back, a minimal gesture that felt enormous in its implications. Sharon smiled with satisfaction that her greeting had been acknowledged, then continued her walk home while Giulio sat in his car, recognizing he'd just made a choice that couldn't be unmade. She'd seen him, had marked his presence in her reality, had created connection that existed now regardless of whether he pursued it further. The anonymity he'd maintained was compromised by a child's wave, innocence colliding with his calculated distance, and destroying it more effectively than any intentional strategy could have. That night at the Meridian building, he asked Catherine directly about Sharon's father, a question so inappropriate, he watched her expression shift through multiple emotions before settling on guarded confusion. She explained with brevity that Sharon's father wasn't in their lives, had never been in their lives in any meaningful way, that Sharon's family consisted of the two of them and no one else. The information matched what birth certificates and records had already told him, but hearing it from Catherine made it real in ways documentation couldn't achieve. He told her about Sophia then, information he'd shared with no one in 5 years, words that emerged without permission from the part of himself he'd believed was successfully buried. He described the accident with clinical detachment that fooled neither of them, explained that his daughter would have been 7 now if physics and timing had aligned differently. Catherine's expression transformed from caution to recognition, understanding passing between them that transcended their different circumstances and connected them through parallel losses of different kinds. The vulnerability created opening that neither of them knew how to navigate. Giulio had revealed information that could be weaponized if Catherine ever understood who he actually was, what he actually did, how the money funding his apparent generosity was generated through operations that destroyed other families. Catherine had accepted intimacy from someone whose attention should have triggered alarm rather than tentative trust. They were walking toward collision, neither could prevent, because the momentum had already carried them too far to retreat safely. Over the following weeks, their conversations extended beyond professional minimums, into territory that resembled friendship, if friendship could exist between people whose power differential made equality impossible. He learned that Catherine had been studying nursing before Sharon's birth had derailed education plans, that she read medical journals during subway commutes, and dreamed of eventually completing her degree. She learned that he'd studied architecture before family business had pulled him in different directions, that he still noticed building design with attention that went beyond property investment values. These exchanges of personal history created illusion of mutual understanding, while fundamental truths remained unspoken. Catherine didn't know that Giulio ran criminal operations. Giulio didn't reveal that he'd been orchestrating improvements in her life since finding Sharon's letter. They constructed relationship on foundation of partial truths and deliberate omissions, building connection that would collapse catastrophically if actual transparency ever occurred. The collision came when Catherine worked late one Friday night, staying past her normal shift to cover for another janitor who'd called in sick. She was cleaning offices on the 18th floor, 2 levels below her usual assignment, when she overheard conversation between men who hadn't noticed her presence. The conversation was in Italian, language she'd studied in high school and community college, understanding enough to recognize they were discussing payment schedules and territory disputes and shipments that needed to arrive without customs interference. She froze in the supply closet where she'd been organizing cleaning materials, understanding with sickening clarity that she was overhearing criminal planning in buildings she'd assumed housed only legitimate business operations. The men's voices were casual, discussing violence and illegal activity with comfort that suggested routine rather than exception. One of them mentioned Giulio's name. Not with title or context, but with the familiarity that indicated they worked directly for him, that he was central figure in whatever organization they represented. The conversation lasted 6 minutes that felt like hours while Catherine remained motionless in the supply closet, afraid that any sound would reveal her presence and transform her from accidental witness into liability that required elimination. She'd heard enough movies and news reports to understand that people who overheard organized crime planning didn't usually survive with their knowledge intact. Her mind raced through impossible calculations about whether she could pretend she hadn't understood Italian, whether she could resign from this job without triggering suspicion, whether Sharon would be safe if Catherine became a problem someone needed to solve. The men finally left, their voices fading down the hallway while Catherine remained in the closet for another 10 minutes, her heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat. When she finally emerged, she moved through the rest of her shift with mechanical precision, completing tasks while her mind tried to reconcile the man who'd been kind to her with the names spoken by criminals discussing operations that required violence. The Giulio who'd shared stories about his dead daughter couldn't be the same Giulio who apparently controlled criminal organization, except they clearly were the same person, and she'd been catastrophically naive. She wanted to believe she'd misunderstood, that the conversation had been about something legal that just sounded criminal in translation. But the pieces aligned too perfectly, explaining the resources that had paid her hospital bills and installed new heating and created break rooms, money that came from sources she'd been deliberately not questioning, because questioning would have meant refusing help Sharon desperately needed. She'd accepted charity from organized crime, had developed connection with someone who built empire through destruction, had allowed herself to trust someone who represented everything she should fear. The question of what to do with this knowledge consumed her thoughts during the subway ride home, during the hours when she should have been sleeping, but instead stared at the ceiling while Sharon breathed peacefully nearby. She could go to police, but she had no evidence beyond overheard conversation in a language she wasn't supposed to understand, and involving police might make her official target rather than accidental witness. She could quit her job, but sudden resignation might draw exactly the attention she needed to avoid, and losing this income would return them to financial desperation the criminal money had temporarily relieved. Or she could continue pretending she knew nothing, maintaining connection with Giulio while protecting Sharon from truth that would shatter the small stability they'd achieved. The choice was between impossible options that all led to variations of catastrophe, moral compromise competing with maternal desperation, in ways that left her nauseous with guilt, regardless of which path she chose. She'd written strongly worded papers in college about people who enabled evil through passive cooperation, never imagining she'd become exactly that person when survival required choosing between principles and her daughter's welfare. Monday morning arrived with Catherine's decision still unmade, exhaustion and fear competing for dominance while she prepared Sharon for school. Her daughter chattered about an art project involving construction paper families, oblivious to the moral crisis consuming her mother's thoughts. Catherine braided Sharon's hair with hands that trembled slightly, wondering if this normalcy was something she'd destroy by choosing principle over pragmatism, or preserve by choosing silence over safety. She avoided the Meridian building that week by trading shifts with another janitor, claiming a scheduling conflict that wasn't entirely fabricated since her internal conflict had become its own kind of schedule disruption. The trade meant working in a different building across town, less pay for more hours, but distance from Giulio felt necessary while she processed the collision between who she'd believed he was and who he apparently actually was. Her absence would be noticed, might trigger exactly the attention she was trying to avoid, but continuing to pretend nothing had changed felt beyond her current acting capabilities. On Wednesday evening, Giulio appeared at her apartment building, a development so unexpected it momentarily froze her thought processes when she saw him through the peephole. He wore clothes less expensive than usual, attempting to blend into a neighborhood where his presence was still obviously wrong, his posture carrying alertness that suggested he understood the risk he was taking by coming here. She opened the door without the chain lock because preventing his entry would only delay inevitable conversation, not prevent it entirely. He noticed her fear immediately, the way her body angled toward Sharon's bedroom door as if preparing to protect her daughter from threat. His expression shifted through several emotions, before settling on something that might have been hurt if people like him were capable of being hurt by distrust. He asked if they could talk, a request phrased as question, but carrying weight of requirement, stepping into her apartment with the careful movements of someone navigating unfamiliar territory where usual rules didn't apply. Sharon was sleeping in the bedroom, her door closed but not locked, because locks inside apartments suggested dangers Catherine preferred Sharon not consider yet. They sat in the small living area that served as kitchen and dining room and family room, inadequate furniture that suddenly felt even more inadequate with Giulio occupying space designed for people with fewer resources and complications. He asked why she'd been avoiding him, question that acknowledged her deliberate absence rather than accepting her scheduling excuse as legitimate. Catherine considered lying, maintaining the pretense that nothing had changed, continuing the performance that had characterized their entire relationship. But something about his presence in her apartment, the vulnerability of him coming to her territory instead of summoning her to his, made honesty feel like the only option that preserved whatever dignity she had left. She told him about the overheard conversation, the Italian words that had revealed truths he'd been carefully concealing, watching his face for reactions that would tell her whether fear was appropriate response. He didn't deny it, which somehow made everything worse because denial would have left space for doubt, for alternative interpretations, for hope that she'd misunderstood. Instead, he confirmed what she'd overheard, with the same clinical detachment he'd used describing his daughter's death, explaining that yes, he ran organizations that operated outside legal boundaries, that the money helping her came from sources that destroyed other people's lives. His honesty felt like cruelty, forcing her to confront complicity she'd been able to ignore while pretending ignorance. She asked him to leave, words that came out stronger than she felt, maternal instinct overriding the gratitude that complicated her ability to fully reject someone who'd probably saved Sharon's life through his criminal generosity. He stood but didn't move toward the door, his attention fixed on Sharon's bedroom with expression that made Catherine's chest tighten because she recognized it as the same expression she wore when watching her daughter sleep. He asked if he could meet Sharon properly, not through car windows or security footage, but as someone real in her life, rather than ghost orchestrating improvements from shadows. The request was so absurd, it momentarily silenced Catherine's objections. He wanted to meet her daughter, to cross from anonymous benefactor into acknowledged presence, to insert himself into Sharon's reality in ways that would make him real rather than theoretical. The danger of that connection stretched beyond immediate physical threat into territory where Sharon could become attached to someone whose life guaranteed eventual catastrophe. Children didn't understand that kindness from dangerous people was still dangerous, that temporary stability built on criminal foundations would eventually collapse. But Sharon had asked Santa for a father, and Giulio had found that letter, and the months since had brought improvements that transcended coincidence into something that felt almost like providence, if providence worked through morally compromised channels. Catherine looked at this man who'd built criminal empire, but who'd also paid hospital bills without requiring gratitude, who'd installed heating that made their apartment livable, who'd revealed his own dead daughter as if that loss created bridge between their incompatible worlds. She couldn't decide if letting him meet Sharon was protecting her daughter or betraying her. The decision was made for her when Sharon's bedroom door opened, the girl emerging in pajamas with the stuffed rabbit she'd had since infancy. She'd woken up from the sound of voices, curiosity overriding tiredness that usually kept her asleep until morning. Her eyes found Giulio immediately, recognition spreading across her face and smile that suggested she'd been waiting for this moment without knowing she was waiting. She called him the Angel Man, the title she'd apparently given him after seeing him wave outside her school. Giulio's expression transformed into something Catherine hadn't seen before, vulnerability that made him look younger and more human than the controlled persona he usually projected. He knelt down to Sharon's level, moving with careful slowness that suggested he understood children required different approach than the adults he usually intimidated. Sharon approached without fear, because she hadn't learned yet that some angels were fallen, that help from complicated sources came with complications that wouldn't be apparent until much later. They talked about her drawings, about the families with 3 figures that she created constantly, about whether she liked school and what her favorite color was, and the kinds of questions adults asked when trying to connect with children through the limited vocabulary of ordinary life. Sharon answered with the openness that characterized children who hadn't yet learned strategic information management, telling him about her art teacher and the candy store window, and how her mommy worked very hard, which is why she was always tired. Each detail she shared was small vulnerability that could be weaponized if Giulio ever became threat instead of protector. Catherine watched this interaction with the helplessness of someone witnessing collision they couldn't prevent, her daughter bonding with a man whose presence represented danger, even while his actions suggested something closer to salvation. The scene was domestic in ways that felt simultaneously wrong and right. Wrong because of who Julio was, and right because Sharon glowed with attention from adult male who wasn't rushing to leave or checking his phone or counting minutes until obligation ended. This was what Sharon had asked Santa for, presence of someone who saw her and engaged with her and made her feel like she mattered. After 20 minutes, Julio stood and told Sharon he needed to leave, but that he hoped to see her again. She asked if he'd come back, question loaded with hope that made Catherine's chest ache, because that hope could be crushed in dozens of ways that Sharon couldn't anticipate. He looked at Catherine when answering, seeking permission he had no right to expect, receiving her slight nod that was less consent than resignation to trajectory already too advanced to redirect safely. When he'd left and Sharon had returned to bed, Catherine sat in the dark living room, trying to calculate whether she'd just made catastrophic mistake or necessary compromise. She'd allowed criminal access to her daughter, had permitted relationship that could end in ways her imagination immediately supplied in vivid detail. But she'd also seen Sharon smile with the particular joy children show when they feel chosen by adult attention, security that had been missing from her daughter's life since birth. The moral clarity she'd possessed before having a child felt like luxury she could no longer afford. The following week, Julio's organization was approached by federal investigators who'd been building case against his operations for 2 years. The pressure had been building gradually, charges being assembled through informant testimony and financial forensics that traced money through laundering channels his accountants had believed were invisible. The investigators wanted specific information about operations Julio ran, offering deals that would reduce his exposure if he provided evidence against larger criminal networks his organization connected to, through business relationships and territorial agreements. The timing was catastrophic, because refusing cooperation meant increased likelihood of prosecution that would remove him from any ability to protect Catherine and Sharon. But cooperation meant becoming informant, meant betraying people who'd been loyal to him for decades, meant destroying the empire he'd built as memorial to grief he'd never properly processed. The choice was between maintaining criminal integrity and preserving possibility of remaining in Sharon's life in ways that required him to not be in prison for 30 years. His second in command, a man named Vincent, who'd worked with Julio since the beginning, noticed the distraction that had infected his boss's decision-making processes. Vincent had survived 2 decades in their business by recognizing patterns before they became problems, by identifying weaknesses before enemies could exploit them, by protecting Julio from himself when necessary. He confronted Julio in the office where they'd planned operations that had built their territory from small neighborhood control to citywide influence. Vincent had done research, the kind of quiet investigation that happened when loyal employees worried their employer had developed liability that could destroy everyone. He knew about Catherine and Sharon, about the hospital payments and heating repairs, and the increasingly frequent visits to their apartment. He explained with the bluntness of someone who'd earned right to speak plainly that Julio's attachment to this family was creating vulnerability that enemies would eventually discover and weaponize. Personal connections were exactly what they'd spent 20 years avoiding because personal connections gave rivals targets beyond the person they actually wanted to hurt. The federal investigators returned with enhanced pressure, evidence that suggested they'd infiltrated deeper into Julio's operations than he'd realized. They had recordings of conversations that shouldn't have been recordable, financial documents that should have been destroyed, testimony from people who shouldn't have been talking. Someone inside his organization was cooperating, feeding information that would eventually build case strong enough to guarantee decades in prison for everyone involved in leadership positions, including Julio himself. Vincent advocated for eliminating the suspected informant, a solution that would have been automatic 5 years ago when Julio made decisions based purely on strategic necessity without moral complications. But the version of Julio that had existed before finding Sharon's letter was different from the version currently calculating consequences of violence he'd once ordered without hesitation. He told Vincent to identify the informant but take no action, buying himself time to determine whether eliminating problems through murder was still something he could order when he was simultaneously trying to become someone worthy of Sharon's trust. The informant was revealed through process of elimination and surveillance to be someone unexpected, a mid-level accountant who'd worked for the organization for 8 years without raising any concerns. His motivation wasn't money or fear, but moral crisis triggered by his teenage daughter asking questions about where his income came from. The same kind of moral crisis Catherine was experiencing, but from the opposite direction. The accountant had decided that preserving his daughter's respect required destroying the organization that paid his salary, sacrifice that Julio understood, even while it threatened everything he'd built. Giulio met with the accountant privately, conversation that violated every security protocol Vincent had established, but that Giulio needed to have without witnesses, who'd expect traditional resolution. The accountant showed up knowing he might not leave alive, courage born from same parental desperation that had driven Catherine to accept help from criminal sources she didn't fully understand. They talked about daughters, about the things fathers did to protect children from truth, about whether redemption was possible for people who'd profited from activities they'd eventually recognized as destroying families like the ones they'd been trying to support. The accountant expected death, but received something more complicated, an offer that would keep him alive while giving Giulio pathway toward the cooperation federal investigators wanted, without completely betraying everyone in his organization. Giulio would help investigators dismantle the upper levels of criminal networks his organization connected to, providing information that would take down people who'd never shown the loyalty his own people had demonstrated. In exchange, he'd negotiate protection for his direct employees who hadn't been involved in the most violent aspects of their operations, essentially destroying his empire while preserving the people who'd built it with him. The decision meant becoming exactly what criminals despised most: an informant who traded cooperation for survival, someone who violated codes that had governed organized crime for generations. Vincent's reaction was immediate and visceral, the kind of betrayal that made 20 years of partnership irrelevant in the face of this ultimate violation. He told Giulio that cooperating with federal investigators would mark him for death from every criminal organization that learned about his choice, that protection deals lasted only until government attention moved elsewhere, that this path led inevitably to witness protection or assassination, depending on how good the government's security actually was, versus how determined his enemies became. Giulio accepted these consequences with the same detachment he'd once used accepting that violence was necessary business cost, except now he was calculating different kind of cost-benefit analysis. Death in 5 years while trying to be a better person seemed preferable to 30 years in prison never having attempted redemption, and Sharon's letter had introduced timeline where redemption mattered enough to risk everything else. He began formal cooperation with investigators, providing information that would dismantle networks while his own organization watched him cross line that turned him from boss into traitor. The cooperation required months of careful testimony, documents provided through channels that kept him alive long enough to be useful to prosecutors building cases against targets more valuable than Giulio himself. He maintained minimal contact with Catherine and Sharon during this period, distance necessary both for their protection and because explaining his choices would have required revealing things that would destroy whatever trust he'd built. They knew only that he'd become less available, his visits sporadic, his attention divided by pressures he couldn't describe, without making them accessories to knowledge that could be dangerous. Sharon asked her mother repeatedly when the angel man would visit again, questions that made Catherine's chest ache because she couldn't explain that angels who built empires through violence eventually faced consequences that removed them from ordinary lives. She told Sharon that he was busy with work, a truth that omitted the nature of work that involved betraying criminal associates to avoid prosecution. The lie felt necessary to preserve Sharon's innocent interpretation of Giulio as helper, rather than complicated figure, whose goodness was inseparable from badness that predated his connection to them. The danger Giulio had been anticipating arrived when Vincent discovered the full extent of his cooperation with federal investigators, information that couldn't be contained once it reached certain channels. Vincent felt betrayed beyond what Giulio's strategic explanations could justify. Loyalty transformed into determination to eliminate the threat Giulio now represented to everyone who'd trusted him. The threat wasn't personal in the way civilian violence was personal, but rather professional elimination of problem that could destroy dozens of people if allowed to continue testifying against connected organizations. Vincent's attempt to solve the Giulio problem led him to the most obvious leverage point: the family that had apparently motivated Giulio's unprecedented choices. Research revealed Catherine's address, Sharon's school schedule, the routines that made them accessible to someone with Vincent's resources and connections. The logic was straightforward. Eliminate the attachment that had corrupted Giulio's judgment. Remove the reason he'd chosen cooperation over loyalty. Demonstrate that personal connections in their world were liabilities that justified the isolation they'd all maintained for decades. Giulio learned about Vincent's plans through the same networks that had kept him alive this long, informants within his former organization who still felt enough loyalty to warn him before acting against him. The timeline was compressed, measured in hours rather than days, requiring immediate action that couldn't be filtered through official channels that moved at bureaucratic speed. He had perhaps 12 hours before Vincent's people would move against Catherine and Sharon. 12 hours to extract them from situation his own choices had created. 12 hours to decide whether saving them was worth the exposure that would likely get him killed in process. He drove to their apartment at 3 a.m. Security detail reduced to single trusted associate because larger group would have attracted exactly the attention he was trying to avoid. Catherine opened the door to his emergency knocking, looking terrified, her instincts correctly interpreting middle-of-night visits as heralds of catastrophe. He explained with brutal efficiency that her life and Sharon's were in immediate danger because of his choices, that they needed to leave within the next 10 minutes, with only what they could carry, that questions would have to wait until they were somewhere safe enough for extended explanations. Sharon woke up confused and frightened by the urgency, her mother packing clothes while Julia watched the street through windows that suddenly felt like vulnerabilities, rather than sources of light. He'd arranged safe house through federal contacts who'd provided it as part of his cooperation deal, protection extended to include people whose only crime was accepting help from him. The location was temporary holding until more permanent arrangements could be made. Witness protection for witnesses who'd never actually witnessed anything except his attempt to be different than what he'd spent 20 years becoming. They left the apartment building through the basement service entrance, avoiding the front door where Vincent's surveillance would be watching for exactly this kind of evacuation. Julio's associate drove while Julio sat in back with Sharon, who'd fallen back asleep against his shoulder with the trust children showed when adults projected certainty even during chaos. Catherine watched them from the front seat with expression that cycled through fear and anger and resignation, her life compressed into 2 bags, while Sharon slept unaware that everything was changing because of letters she'd written months ago believing in magic. The safe house was in a neighborhood. Vincent's people wouldn't think to search immediately. Protection that would last perhaps 48 hours before extended networks located them through systematic grid searches. Federal marshals arrived at dawn to begin process of relocating Catherine and Sharon into witness protection program, bureaucracy that moved faster than usual because prosecutors didn't want their key witness's motivation eliminated before he finished testifying. The marshals explained that Catherine and Sharon would receive new identities in new city, that contact with anyone from their previous life would be permanently severed, including Julio once immediate danger passed. Sharon woke up in unfamiliar room surrounded by strangers discussing plans for her future without her input. The confusion and fear that children experience when adult world intrudes with consequences they can't understand. She asked for Julio, who'd stepped outside to give marshals space to explain options to Catherine without his presence complicating her decision-making. Catherine held her daughter while federal employees described logistics of disappearing, protection offered at cost of erasing everything they'd known, including people they'd just started letting themselves trust. The choice was between accepting witness protection that would keep them alive but isolated, or refusing and hoping that Vincent's threat would dissipate once Julio's usefulness to prosecutors ended, and his death removed any reason to pursue his connections. Neither option was good. Both required gambling with Sharon's safety, in ways that made Catherine want to scream at universe that had led them from poverty to danger, without providing any stable ground between extremes. She looked at Julio through the window where he stood making phone calls that presumably determined whether any third option existed beyond the binary marshals presented. He returned with proposal the marshals hadn't mentioned because it required resources federal government couldn't or wouldn't provide. His organization, despite Vincent's betrayal, still contained people loyal enough to help with extraction and protection that didn't require government involvement. These people could facilitate relocation that maintained some connection to previous life, rather than total erasure, protection that came from criminal infrastructure instead of federal infrastructure. The downside was that this option kept them somewhat within Julio's world, rather than completely separating them from it. Danger that was different from Vincent's threat, but not necessarily less significant. Catherine made decision that morning sitting in safe house surrounded by federal marshals and criminal associates, and her sleeping daughter, who'd asked Santa for a father, and somehow gotten this instead. She chose the option that kept the possibility of Julio remaining in their lives, rather than option that guaranteed safety through permanent separation, maternal calculation, that Sharon needed the connection more than she needed perfect safety, that might not actually exist regardless of which protection they accepted. The marshals objected strenuously, but couldn't force compliance. Authority limited by the fact that Catherine wasn't actually witness to anything, except accepting help she hadn't understood, came from criminal sources. 1 year later, Sharon turned 6 in a small house near the coast of North Carolina, a location chosen for its distance from New York, and for the community that asked few questions about new arrivals with unclear histories. The house wasn't large, but it was warm, heated adequately by systems that worked properly, because Giulio had learned that functional heating mattered in ways he'd never considered when he'd owned buildings where tenants froze. Sharon's bedroom had windows that overlooked water instead of buildings, fresh air replacing the industrial smell that had characterized their New York apartment. Catherine worked at a community health clinic under her own name because witness protection hadn't been necessary once Giulio's testimony had concluded, and Vincent had been arrested for attempted murder charges unrelated to Catherine's family. She'd completed the nursing certification she'd abandoned years ago, classes paid for through the legitimate portion of Giulio's remaining assets that hadn't been seized by federal prosecutors. The work satisfied something in her that janitorial positions never had, using education she'd thought was permanently beyond reach in circumstances that had made education seem like luxury for people with more stable lives. Giulio lived in the same town under his own name, because the cooperation deal had concluded with him receiving immunity from prosecution in exchange for testimony that had dismantled networks larger than his own organization. He'd lost the empire he'd spent 20 years building, assets seized or dissolved, connections severed, reputation destroyed among the criminal communities that had once feared and respected him. What remained was legitimate security consulting business that employed his particular skills without requiring criminal applications, work that paid significantly less than his previous operations, but that allowed him to sleep without calculating which enemies might eliminate him before morning. He saw Sharon and Catherine daily now, proximity that had developed gradually over the year as threat levels decreased, and they'd all adjusted to transformed circumstances. The relationship between Giulio and Catherine remained complicated. Friendship mixed with romance neither of them had explicitly acknowledged, because explicitly acknowledging would have required addressing whether love was possible between people whose history included criminal enterprise and desperate acceptance of help from morally compromised sources. They existed in careful balance between what they were and what they might become, if they admitted to feelings that had developed despite impossible odds. Sharon knew Giulio simply as the person who'd become her father, in all the ways that mattered, except biology and legal documentation. He attended her school functions, helped with homework that required adult patience, read bedtime stories with the particular care of someone who'd lost one daughter and been given unlikely chance at being father to another. She called him by his first name, because calling him Dad seemed to require permission neither he nor Catherine had explicitly granted, though the word hovered unspoken in the space between them, waiting for someone to be brave enough to claim it. The anniversary of finding Sharon's letter arrived in December, winter in North Carolina, much gentler than the brutal New York cold that had defined their previous existence. Giulio mentioned the date to no one because acknowledging it would have required explaining the chain of improbable events that had led from letter to here. Coincidences stacked so high they suggested something beyond random chance at work. He thought about the garbage truck that had torn the bag, about the parking garage where he'd found purple crayon words, about every decision point where different choices would have prevented this improbable family from forming. Sharon's health had stabilized in the year since leaving New York, consistent medical care, and adequate nutrition and stress reduction contributing to respiratory system that finally functioned without constant crisis. She'd grown 3 inches, gained weight that made her look less fragile, developed confidence that came from security she'd never experienced during her first 5 years. The transformation was visible in photographs Catherine took compulsively, documenting the girl Sharon was becoming compared to the struggling child she'd been. Christmas approached with Sharon creating cards and decorations, her artistic talent nurtured now through classes and supplies that were no longer unaffordable luxuries. She made card for Giulio that featured 3 stick figures holding hands, the same family composition she'd drawn on the Santa letter, but now representing reality rather than wish. The middle figure was labeled with his name in letters that no longer leaned in different directions, her handwriting having improved through year of school and practice and stability that allowed focus on education rather than survival. On Christmas Eve, Sharon asked if she could write another letter to Santa, tradition she wanted to maintain despite growing understanding that the magic might be less literal than she'd believed at 5. Catherine agreed, providing paper and the same purple crayon Sharon had used for the original letter that had changed everything. Sharon worked on her letter with concentration that suggested importance beyond simple holiday tradition, folding it carefully when finished, and handing it to Giulio instead of putting it in mailbox, because she apparently understood that Santa worked through human channels more often than magical ones. Giulio opened the letter with hands that trembled slightly, nervous in a way he hadn't been nervous facing armed enemies or federal prosecutors. The letter was brief, written in Sharon's improving but still childish handwriting, asking Santa to let her keep what she'd already received. She didn't ask for toys or games or any of the material things children typically requested, just for the angel man to stay, and for her mommy to stop looking worried, and for their house to remain warm through winter. The requests were simultaneously modest and enormous, asking for nothing except the stability that most children took for granted. He showed the letter to Catherine, who read it with eyes that filled with tears she didn't bother hiding, because hiding emotions required energy she no longer had after a year of constant adjustment to transformed life. They stood together in kitchen of house that wasn't perfect, but was theirs, built on foundation of choices that had destroyed criminal empire and created something closer to family than either had expected to find. Sharon watched them from the doorway with expression that suggested she understood more about adult complexity than 6-year-olds were supposed to understand, witness to her own story's improbable development. The next morning, Christmas arrived with presents Sharon had requested through normal channels rather than letters to Santa, toys and books and art supplies that represented childhood allowed to be childhood instead of survival training. But the real gift was Julio telling Sharon she could call him Dad if she wanted to, permission granted through the terror of someone offering vulnerability that could be rejected. Sharon considered this seriously for approximately 3 seconds before testing the word, finding it fit properly in ways that first names never quite had, despite year of practice. Catherine watched Julio become father to her daughter through nothing except choice and consistency, the irony not lost on her that Sharon's letter asking Santa for a dad had somehow manifested exactly what she'd requested through the most improbable channels imaginable. The Mafia boss who'd found a letter in his parking garage had dismantled his entire life to become the person that letter had asked for. Transformation that seemed more like miracle than anything Christmas mythology promised. They ate breakfast together while snow fell outside, the kind of gentle snow that decorated rather than threatened, beauty without danger that characterized their new existence. Julio had spent 5 years believing his capacity for family had died with Sophia and his wife, that the accident had destroyed not just people, but possibility of ever building family again. Sharon had proved that belief wrong simply by writing letter that had found him when he'd needed finding, even though he hadn't known he'd needed it. The house was warm, Sharon was healthy, Catherine was working in profession she'd dreamed about, and Julio was living outside criminal enterprise that had consumed him for 20 years. None of it was perfect. Trauma didn't disappear just because circumstances improved, and they were all still learning how to be family that hadn't been formed through traditional means. But perfect wasn't the goal anymore. Not when good enough was so much better than what any of them had expected when letter first arrived requesting something that had seemed impossible. Sharon fell asleep that night holding both Julio's and Catherine's hands, positioned between them in configuration that matched the stick figures she'd been drawing for a year and a half. The 3 figures had finally manifested in reality, family built not through biology or marriage, but through letter and choices, and the improbable collision of desperation, and resources that had somehow created love from circumstances that should have produced nothing except more pain. They were family because they'd chosen to be, because girl had asked and man had answered, and woman had accepted help that came through wrong channels, but led to right destination. Outside, winter settled over North Carolina with the gentleness that characterized their new life, cold that could be managed rather than cold that threatened survival. Somewhere in the house, Sharon's original letter to Santa rested in frame on Julio's desk, purple crayon words that had traveled through garbage trucks and parking garages to find exactly the person who needed to find them. The letter had asked for father, and the universe or fate or random chance had delivered one who'd needed daughter just as desperately, symmetry that felt too perfect to be accidental even for people who didn't believe in magic. The story of how Mafia boss became father to girl who'd written letter to Santa would never be told outside the 3 people who'd lived it, secret that protected them from scrutiny that would have complicated the peace they'd built from chaos. But the story existed regardless of whether anyone else knew it, testament to the possibility that sometimes impossible things happened, when desperation and hope and willingness to transform collided in exactly the right way. They were family now, built from ashes of what they'd each lost or never had, imperfect and complicated, and absolutely real in ways that mattered more than any traditional family structure ever could. Thank you all for following this story. If it touched your heart, please write in the comments from which place you're watching this, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the video. Your support means everything and helps me continue bringing you more stories like this one. Sometimes the most impossible miracles happen through the smallest gestures. A letter, a choice, a second chance that changes everything.